It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. Oh boy, I haven't revisited this movie in almost 40 years. 1983, Something Wicked This Way Comes was a Walt Disney production and came at a peculiar time for the company. It's kind of hard to imagine this these days, but at one point in time, Disney was struggling mightily at the box office. In fact, not every one of their now classic animated features from earlier in their history were all that successful either. It was only later, as parents and grandparents would reintroduce movies to kids when the older films would get recycled in re-releases, that Disney was able to kind of really build upon something. Actually, between home video, cable television, and of course their theme parks, that would probably do more for Disney than most of their films from the mid-60s to the mid-80s would. Now, Disney was trying all sorts of things by the late 70s to change the course of their lagging business. The comedies they were releasing in the 70s, meant for a wide family audience and usually rated G, were tanking pretty badly and getting awful reviews. There is a significant number of consecutive years that saw unforgettable and poorly received movies getting released by the company after Walt Disney died. In fact, I would suspect that Herbie the Love Bug would be the most endearing live-action character most people would remember from Disney in the 70s, and I'm not sure anyone likes those movies all that much. Yes, I know there were some other movies that came out during that decade that people would remember, but Herbie is kind of the one every Gen X kid saw. In 1979, Disney released the cult classic The Black Hole. This was also not well received and was released around the exact same time as Star Trek The Motion Picture was put into movie theaters, so it was unsurprisingly left in the dust of the box office race. While poorly received, it's gotten some reevaluation from some corners of folks who range from ages 35 to 50, and it's become a little bit of a more fondly admired movie for all of its flaws. It was 1982's Tron that really showed that Disney could do something really neat and interesting in live-action film, but still, Tron was not the hit it really should have been. So now, we get to the mid-80s era, and Disney is kind of warbling around and losing its way really badly. The Black Hole was the company's first ever PG-rated movie. It failed. Tron was really well liked, but it failed at the box office. Sure, The Fox and the Hound, when it came to their animated movies, was showing critics and audiences that there was still a little bit of magic in the kingdom, but at this point, I guess they decided that it wouldn't hurt to make an out-and-out horror film, or as I should put it, a dark fantasy with a lot of horror elements. And that's where Something Wicked This Way Comes lands. Ray Bradbury was the author of the source material. Bradbury is kind of considered one of the present-day masters of genre, particularly in sci-fi and horror. However, he also did some mysteries and fantasy as well. But Bradbury goes back to the late 30s, where his earliest published works appeared in Forrest J. Ackerman's fanzine Imagination, while Bradbury was still just a teenager. Ackerman would even go on to fund Bradbury's own fanzine a little bit later. And as much as it might surprise you, Bradbury was best known as a short story writer and a screenplay writer than he was a novelist. He only produced 11 novels in his career that spanned nearly 70 years. He did score pretty big with The Martian Chronicles, which was a little more of a series of shorter stories that were already previously printed elsewhere, but followed that up with 1953's Fahrenheit 451, which usually becomes required reading for most who are interested in dystopian fiction. 1962 brought Something Wicked This Way Comes, and then 1972's The Halloween Tree that traced some of the history of Samhain and Halloween. Those four novels for sure were ones I knew he wrote, but when it came to writing for the screen, he worked a lot on TV, penning a couple of episodes of Twilight Zone, interestingly 25 years apart, and then doing episodes of the Alfred Hitchcock Show. He often adapted his own works like the Martian Chronicles, as well as this one. And of all the movies based on his works, you'd think that he'd probably want to make sure he adapted himself, Fahrenheit 451 was not one. But most might remember Bradbury on TV being pretty much the one-man show that was the Ray Bradbury Theater, which ran for 6 seasons and 65 episodes. He was always seen in his office pounding away on a typewriter, something that you would likely see him do anyway, as he literally wrote something every day of his adult life. Oh, and something interesting to add, Bradbury himself penned every single one of the 65 episodes. The guy was a bit of a machine. Now, as for me, I said I hadn't seen this movie in almost 40 years. I saw this movie once when I was a wee lad, and it scared the ever-loving crap out of me. I never wanted to watch it again, and the mere specter of this movie would kind of haunt me. Now, I know it had something to do with Jonathan Pryce's character, Mr. Dark, but I really can't tell you anything more than that. I have no idea how this will even live up to anything once we start digging in. So let's see what happens when I revisit the scariest movie a 6 or 7-year-old Geoff Arbuckle ever did see. The story is told in retrospect by one of the main child characters, Will Holloway. He's now an adult, kind of thinking back on his childhood. It's October in and around this small town called Greentown, Illinois. And it's sort of a simple town, but picturesque in a Norman Rockwell sort of way. There is a tale to tell for each and every member of this town. The town has a barber who always talks about women that he likely never met and will surely never know. The tobacco shop owner is obsessed with money and plays the numbers constantly, hoping beyond hope that he will win the $100,000 jackpot. There's another man who is missing a leg and an arm who runs the local bar, who used to be a football hero. The old school teacher lady, they say, once upon a time, was the most beautiful woman in town. And Will tells about his best friend, his shadow, his blood brother, Jim Nightshade. Apparently, one of the things he remembers most fondly about his childhood is that he and Jim used to do everything together. As a quick aside, Ed the bartender, the amputee who used to be a football hero, he's played by James Stacy, who was really kind of at the start of his career, kind of ramping up in the early 70s. But he really was an amputee after being hit by a drunk driver while he was riding his motorcycle. Will's story soon turns to his father, Charles, played by Jason Robards. And at this point in time, Robards was already a 2-time winner of Academy Awards for Best Supporting Actor. But Jim's father supposedly is an adventurer, or so he says he is, but Will believes that maybe Jim's father is really kind of more of a deadbeat and is never going to return home. Jim thinks Charles Holloway is a scaredy cat and will never go on an adventure because he's too old and tired now to really experience life. Charles also lives with a great deal of regret. He says later on in the movie that he failed to save Will when Will got swept up by a river current when he was only about 4 years old. And it's because Charles was raised by a man who didn't think it was right to teach little boys to swim. The whole event weighs heavily on the Holloway boys and kind of strains their relationship. Meanwhile, coming into town is a lightning rod salesman by the name of Tom Fury. He says the rod will protect homes from a coming storm, and he sells one to Jim, despite Jim's mom, played by Diane Ladd, thinking it's a really silly thing to buy. But soon that wind and thunder comes rolling in, along with a carnival. The town is being littered with the ads for this carnival run by a peculiar man by the name of Mr. Dark. And this mysterious man, Mr. Dark, who always wears a black suit, is the one kind of going around town just kind of throwing these advertisements on the ground and letting the wind carry them to people. Something else peculiar is that both Charles Holloway and Tom Fury notice a peculiar-looking woman encased in what appears to be ice, where a coffin is typically displayed in a window for the funeral home in town. Now, the train carrying the carnival comes rumbling down the tracks into Greentown, and on one of the cars is a familiar-looking block of ice. But the train lets out a whine similar to the cry of a banshee that causes a statue in the nearby graveyard to appear to crack and emit a red light. When the boys chase that train to a field, they see that the carnival is mysteriously already set up as if it's been there for days. They sneak around the cobweb-filled trailer of the Dust Witch, who's played by Pam Grier, who uses her pet tarantulas to scare the boys off. The next day, Will and Jim return to the carnival and realize to their disappointment that it's just a plain old carnival. However, there's something peculiar about this place. Ed the bartender wins a ticket to the bizarre Hall of Mirrors, and in the mirror, he sees that his leg and arm have both returned. The boys see their teacher, Miss Foley, staggering out of the Hall of Mirrors and seems to be dazed and a little bit confused. At one of the games of chance, the man who owns the cigar shop wins $1,000 and a ride on the Ferris wheel with Pam Grier. What a lucky guy. The adults in the town seem to be getting everything they could ever possibly want, but they often go missing shortly after receiving their wish. When the boys are caught sneaking around the carousel by Mr. Dark and one of his employees, Mr. Cougar, he gives the boys free tickets to return to ride the carousel at a later time, but becomes quite suspicious of them and plans to keep an eye on both of them. Jim convinces Will to stay after sundown to sneak around. They watch Dark turn the carousel on with Cougar riding one of the horses, and they notice that it spins backwards and it turns Cougar into a little boy. Dark sends Cougar off to go about his work. The boys eventually end up at Miss Foley's house and discover that Cougar is there posing as her nephew, but later that night, when alone, Miss Foley begins to grow young again, and yeah, she was rather pretty. But the wish of being young again comes with a terrible price. She loses her sight. Jim runs off for the carnival and hopes that he can get on the carousel so that he can be made older. They find that Dark has captured Tom Fury, and so that they can find out when the lightning and rain is coming. They see that some of the other people in town are kind of posed in this tent, almost like a wax museum. Dark first tries to get Fury to tell him by enticing him with Pam Grier, but then when he resists that, he tries electrocuting the old man to get him to tell him what he wants to know. Dark then tells the Dust Witch to hunt the boys down once they're discovered and bring them back to him. She tries to get the boys who are hiding in Jim's room by first trying to get in as a green gas, but then soon the whole place becomes overrun by tarantulas. However, lightning strikes Jim's previously purchased lightning rod, and both boys wake up from a shared nightmare. The next day after church, Dark leads a parade through town looking for the boys, and Dark approaches Charles and his doctor looking for the two boys, and Charles quickly realizes that Jim and Will are indeed in trouble. He finds the boys and they head to the library, and they learn from Will's grandfather's journal that the autumn carnival arrived in 1891, and again many years before that. When the carnival comes, misfortune comes with it. Each time, the carnival left as a most peculiar storm arrived. Will and Jim hide as Dark arrives at the library, and he tries to entice the boys, but they don't give in, so he then tries to entice Charles by offering him his youth again, but Charles refuses. He knocks Charles out and captures the boys and takes them to the carnival. When Charles comes to, he goes to the carnival just as the storm comes blowing in, and on the way in, he finds Jim's mother, who thinks that she's waiting for her husband to arrive so that they can ride the carousel together to turn back the clock. But Charles is able to convince her that it's not real. Charles is then led into the House of Mirrors, where it forces him to face his regret of not saving his son. Just as it appears the Dust Witch is going to drown him in that regret, Will confesses his love for his father, which forces the witch away. As lightning strikes the carnival, Tom Fury uses a lightning rod to impale the Dust Witch. Will and Charles goes to the carousel to save Jim, and it's this time that Charles is finally the hero by grabbing Jim as lightning again strikes and begins to melt Mr. Dark. Charles tells Will not to be sad for Jim, who doesn't appear to be coming to, but the only way to save his friend is to be happy and force all of the bad stuff away. Jim wakes up in the carousel, the storm, and the lightning destroys Mr. Dark, freeing the town from his negative influence. Now, I think I finally understand why I used to think this movie was so terrifying. Okay, yeah, the Dust Witch hunting the boys and sending hundreds of spiders after them, and Dark revealing himself as a truly dark figure is scary enough, but there's actually more to it than that. This is a fairly deep movie in a few regards. In the most obvious way, it's an idyllic little Midwestern town, not too far from what I could imagine being from the Midwest myself. But it gets corrupted by something otherworldly. That's an easy thing to kind of see and kind of dread, and all the stuff that kind of underlines everything in this movie and this kind of supposedly picture-perfect little town. Also, you're supposed to think of fairs and carnivals as being fun and happy places. The organ music that you associate with these types of things are meant to be uplifting, yet here, it uncovers all that dread and creates this atmosphere that rots the town from the inside out. However, the big theme of this movie is too much for a little boy of only 6 or 7 to fully understand. Jason Robards has a line in which he says that in the end, you don't regret the things you have done, but the things that you never did. There's a lot here about loss and regret and growing old. Robards' character is all about fearing death, and therefore he fears living to get to that ultimate death that even his doctor warns against. Then you have Jim Nightshade, who doesn't really know his father. He ran off. Will Calloway knows his father, but it's like watching him wither away in front of him because he carries so much regret that it stands in the way of his living. So interestingly, it was Jim's father who ultimately saved Will that day that he was taken by the river's current. It was like the one kid who had a father had the other kid's father do something his own father should have done. It's kind of sad for both of these kids. When you really get down to it, this movie is all about those sad people who didn't leave a small town and all those regrets that they ultimately live with the rest of their lives. And that's my first like about this movie. So let's get to the second of 3 likes that I have for Something Wicked This Way Comes. The production of the design of this movie is fantastic. It's a little classic in the sense of like Huck Finn or Tom Sawyer, where it's about these 2 kids who are just kind of enjoying their youth. But it's also a little bit like Gremlins in the Kingston Falls kind of small town where you know everyone and their secrets. But the look of the movie is great. You truly believe that this little town is a little ways outside of your city, far enough away to remain isolated from the more modern stuff most every other place would have. It's hard to exactly say when this movie takes place, but you can also believe it's not that long ago either. There's a timeless element to this movie that only expands on the general appreciation I have for this movie's look. Thirdly, this movie has a pretty good cast. You have recognizable faces like Diane Ladd and James Stacey, and during this period of time, Royal Dano, who plays Tom Fury, was always good in supporting roles playing kind of kooky old men. Pam Grier is fantastic as the Dust Witch. She's perfect to play something beautiful and exotic, but also really dangerous. But the 3 scenes in which you have Jason Robards going up against Jonathan Pryce are really the best. Robards is already a top-notch actor, and you can already see that Pryce is going to be a force to be reckoned with in his career too. There is so much energy coming from their scenes. When Robards tries to stand up to the imposing Pryce, he's outmatched and easily defeated. Interestingly, in each of the 3 scenes the 2 actors share, It's always Price who comes out stronger and seemingly more powerful than the ultimate hero of the movie. It's an interesting way to show something of a parable on how good has to struggle to remain good, while evil makes things look easy, but will also be defeated somewhat easily because of their pride. I just kind of made that up on the fly, but maybe there's a nugget of truth there. In the end, Something Wicked This Way Comes isn't really a horror movie at all. I was terrified of it when I was a kid for all sorts of reasons, but my little kid head probably just got stuck with all the spiders in the one nightmare scene, and the fact that carnivals are supposed to be happy places and this one wasn't. Of course, since I realized that carnivals have all sorts of dark nooks and crannies to stuff some scary shit into, so, in the end, this probably ends up kind of helping shape a lot of the stuff that I ultimately liked when I grew up anyway. But that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. Also, come September, there will be new episodes of Film Seizure coming, but you can also catch up on some of our best of episodes that we've been releasing since we took the summer off. But don't forget to follow Film Seizure, at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieenema.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. Next time around, it's time to deal with another monster that might just be stalking another child in The Babadook. Until next week, stay spooky.